Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first case deep dive. Excited to have everybody here and welcoming Jennifer McNelly, who has graciously volunteered her time and deep expertise on this topic of workforce development. She has been in the workforce world in many a capacity, from the government side to the trade association side and everything in between. So without further ado, Jennifer, you are welcome to take the stage here and share with us your pearls. Oh, you are on mute, Jennifer.
Darn, it always starts out that way, right? I was going to say pearls, grains of sand, kind of depends where you are in this journey. But to my case colleagues, it is an honor and a pleasure to share with you what is a 30-year career in this space before the term workforce development even existed. And I happen to have the unique lens now for the last, 15 plus years as an executive in the association space. But as Shira mentioned, my background and the lens that I brought, and probably why I was hired for the job I have today, is the intersection of people and the world of work. And in the context of that, experience in every sector of the economy. As Shira mentioned, I spent time in service. I was an industry person recruited to the U.S. Department of Labor to run industry engagement. Actually, during the Bush administration, when people were at the front end of thinking about how do I find workers. And I managed a portfolio. And again, I was the industry person brought in to translate to government. What does industry need? And think about U.S. Department of Labor. Their job is to get people jobs. So in its simplest term, connect supply and demand. And it was and it's my work started from the private sector side during the Clinton administration, and this work continues today. So for those of us that have spent time in the hallowed halls of government, you know that the second the next administration turns, baby goes out with the bathwater. Some of the resources I'll share with you today are resources that I developed in the early 2000s. And before that, my work was in the automotive industry with our nation's OEMs, building public-private partnerships. And I share that context because it informs my lens of how do you get employers that compete to cooperate. And in this case, it was the leadership of General Motors modeling, not even for them as manufacturers, but for their dealerships. In order to sell cars, you got to have people that can fix them. In order to fix them, the dealers need to have qualified technicians. So started with General Motors, the CEO of GM at that time, then went to his fellow OEMs and said, this isn't just my problem, this is our problem. So in the nicest sense, I shared with Shira, I've made every mistake in the book, and to the extent that others don't do that, I think that's great. It accelerates the knowledge curve. I'm going to give you a lot of information today, and if you are ever interested in having an offline conversation, again, back to my time at U.S. Department of Labor, I ran industry engagement. I managed a portfolio of almost $1 billion worth of public-private investment in trying to fix the bridge between sources of talent and the employers that needed them. And some of what I will share will help set the context of, despite the fact that we all think we're unique, we're all the same. And we spend 80% of our time arguing over what we are the same on, when it's probably really a delta of 20% difference that ultimately is going to be the responsibility of employers. So that's kind of the very eclectic lens that I have in service for today. And I'm going to start, and at any point, if you have a question, raise your hand. Again, I offered to take offline conversations. The journey for every sector is unique but common. And I'm going to start with the definition, and this one comes out of, I think, the Federal Reserve, but sort of what is the challenge that employers are facing. And I'm pretty confident each and every one of you has heard from your membership, whether they are individuals or companies. I can't find the people I need. They don't show up on time. They turn over. They want more money. They want. there is a Denise, I'm leaning into my Foresight Works. I happened to sit on the committee for ASAE and looking at future trends. And my first piece of counsel to you as executives is you have to understand the downstream trends influencing your industry. And those trends could be cultural, and they could be systematic, and they could be philosophical. There are. And the example I will give in the auto industry is I had to anchor the case in what I called the for a nickel more. The dealers weren't willing to pay more, yet all people did was cycle down the street to the next dealer for a nickel more. Understanding the lens of the candidate is as important as understanding the influence that is driving change in the industry. Again, what does that mean? So from a safety perspective, when I think about our role and responsibility, let's assume all of us have this challenge, because statistically we do. There aren't enough people. There are too many jobs. They may or may not be paying adequate wages, and competition is now global. So it means jobs are going to move, and the pace at which they move is going to influence, I believe, what kind of strategy you as a CEO need to consider when solving or supporting your members in this space. Another example is, again, statistically, if you look at birth rates around the world, there is this social tension between countries that have people but don't have talent they need, and countries that have talent that's retiring and aging out and can't necessarily do the jobs as they're designed today. So again, back to the design associated with it. So step one in this journey is what is truly short, medium, and long term around the trends that are influencing the sector I lead. So back to example within safety. So safety hits every industry. Our focus as ASSP is the professional that shows up and keeps everybody alive. With that lens, my competition to future state as a CEO is ChatGPT. You can log in today and get an answer. Might not be a good answer, but the fact that we lead in 120 consensus standards documented by best practices of industry that we then monetize into education means we better know what the heck is going on in the technology space, because our members could become irrelevant. That's one side of it. So technology is going to outpace our public education system. And the education system is the slowest mover in the market space. So if you anchor your strategy in the public education system, you will never close the gap in demand. And that sounds harsh, but statement of fact. Every employer says people coming out of even 4-year degrees don't have the skills they need because they're missing the people side. They're missing what leadership is. They're missing what influence is. Step number 2, understand what that market gap is for you. In my case, it's not a technical gap. You never have an executive say they don't know the basics about safety. What they don't know is how to apply it in business operations to drive influence in an environment of diminishing resources and higher expectations. That's a very different gap than I can't find a technician. So, and they're not mutually exclusive, but step number 1 is you have to understand that level of dynamic, and you don't need to understand it to the extent that I do. That isn't necessary, but you need to know the basics so you don't end up with a strategy that is out of alignment. The second is to understand your own resource allocations. So if you look technically from the Federal Reserve, what is workforce development? It's all these things and then some. Having stood before 4,000 plus industry executives across 18 sectors of our economy, I'll come back to. They all said they didn't show up with what they needed on time, drug-free. That's not a very high bar. associated with, are you breathing on the mirror today or not? And I say that tongue in cheek because everybody would say that, but that really was not their expectation. They wanted them to show up, be fully prepared to work, 100% productive on day one, with or without an investment that the company was going to make in them. And if you look at workforce development, so guidance number 3, if you're looking at workforce development as a strategy and an investment, you need to step back as the association and say, not just what am I doing as a CEO in this space, where is the money truly being spent against the challenge with my membership? Because what I do know statistically is the majority of the investment happens in the world of work, period. And the investment companies are willing to make is that 20% difference, that my way difference. Why did I sit in a room with every CEO? They didn't even staff it down. Best room I've ever been in, a room full of CEOs and a room full of security guards all standing behind them, and the rest of us staff sitting in the back of the room. Because 80% of the basic skills they all needed were the same. The 20% difference became the cultural difference between what General Motors needed, what Ford needed, what Toyota needed, wasn't the basics. So if you can figure out where their investment, the top of it, if you're looking at it as a pyramid, where is the top of their investment being spent? Because if that's where they're going to spend the money, that's not where you spend money. What is the step below? Is the step below, and that's where you get into, is it pipeline development? Is it recruiting and screening? Is it training and education? Is it retention and upskill? Any one of these workforce development strategies can run your bank account down. Pick the right one to all of those influences and factors associated with it. And I'll give you, so the example at the front end of my career, and interestingly enough, the example at my last posting at the NAM running the Manufacturing Institute were one and the same. It was an apprenticeship model. I supported a visit to Germany. We found apprenticeship. We found apprenticeship a long time ago. We called it different things. We called it internships. It is about the experience of work-based learning. Where does most learning happen? On the job? What does it look like? We benchmarked the European model and modeled it in the US. And during my time with the automotive industry and during my time at US Department of Labor, we actually changed the apprenticeship structure from a federal government program, we all know how hard that is to do, to better align with industry demands and flexibility. And it used to be what I affectionately call butts in seats. How much time did it take somebody, predominantly driven by organized labor? So if you have a workforce or companies that are heavily unionized, there's another cultural influence. Most of them are time in place development programs. We've modeled that in IT and healthcare, in low-end jobs and high-end jobs, to be about a competency-based approach. So as you move into design or thinking about design, you have to think, are my people and structures butts in seats? They think this needs to happen because, I'll use safety as an example. OSHA will not accept in today's world, which I just find crazy, online education. They do not believe that if you have hands-on, that you are getting the skills you need. So we have a regulatory influence that informs whether or not our training can be in person or virtual. We can get some of it done that way, but if we don't have a closing hands-on component in some way, shape, or form, government isn't going to consider it valid, which is, that's my cross to bear, that I can take care of that over time with the fact that the pandemic has influenced whether or not that's reality or not. But again, are there regulatory influences? The aerospace and aviation industry, highly regulated on how many hours. It's not necessarily the case in IT. They want to know, can you do the job? Therefore, it's a competency based. So you have to know that. So back to the apprenticeship model, the one that we set up in the auto industry was a pipeline called 2+2. We did actually go back to secondary education, where there were community and technical colleges, and where there were high schools feeding into them. And every one of the OEMs had a program where, you know, it was the T10 program or the ACAP program. Each automotive industry had its own set of community colleges where it was doing the next level training. And we built the pipeline from high school into community college. And again, there's a lot more dual enrollment that's happening between high school and community colleges. But I've heard this from my own members at ASSP. Well, Jennifer, just go get into the high schools. I will not compete in the high schools today if there are not programs that are already safety linked, because there's too much demand on public education. I'm a STEM field. How do I leverage the STEM field? So within pipeline development and apprenticeship, if it doesn't exist, you will not be successful at setting it up systematically. Your members may have enough influence in a single location, a high school where there's a big facility or something, that they could, because in the end, what the community and technical college is judged against is, did people get jobs? Unlike higher education, where they count degree completion, they count degree completion in community colleges, but every program has to be linked to job placement. So with every one of these factors, there's a series of questions you have to ask yourself based on where that pyramid sits and the level that you can have the greatest influence in. So though you often hear, because it's the experience of business, oh, just go get more high school students excited about careers. You got to take them at the point at which they're knocking on the door or close to the door, or leverage the organizations that exist to do that, things like Skills USA. So before I get into what does that look like and what have I driven for ASSP since I walked in the door, when this was, of course, the same challenge given graciously to every CEO in the association world. Any questions on sort of the framing, what to think about, etc.? It's not your last chance to ask questions either. Okay. Hearing none, I'm going to say how did I show up at ASSP? What did I have to understand? I gave the example of ChatGPT. The other thing I had to understand is, what were the assets that we had as a society to meet this need? If this was, interview question 101, Jennifer, we struggled with, how are you going to, what is your vision for? We've all been asked that question in the interview process. Here's what it looked like for me. And it will be 5 years this August. I see something in chat here. I didn't know if it was a question or not.
It's a comment.
Okay.
Affirming what you talked about in terms of the CTE world from Brian.
Yeah. And he's in Ohio. They have a pretty good CTE dual enrollment program there. Okay, so when I arrived at ASSP almost 5 years ago, we had two assets. We had the society itself and we had the foundation. And the foundation, like many, had an independent board with an independent strategy that has a pretty decent sized endowment to give scholarships away. And they did some research, but they dabbled in research. I won't discount that they had done some stuff, but it wasn't a core competency of the foundation. What we were really good at doing was taking people's money and turning around and giving it to potential students. Day one question, how many individuals are we impacting? We gave 135. I asked this question on a conference call yesterday. How many scholarships did we give away last year? 135. How many students participated in our future safety leaders? 210. okay, what happened to all the other students? We had a culture in the foundation of giving money, you could argue, to those that needed it the least. Highest grades, high grade point average, the best of the best got to show up, which meant with an $8 million foundation in net assets, we were helping 300 people a year. My challenge to my director was, how do you reach more, period? We had this conversation yesterday around key performance indicators. So the influence we had to the foundation, step number one. So do you have control of the asset or not? In this case, independent board, separate strategic plan. Answer to that was no. There were two things that needed to happen within our foundation. Number one was we needed to change our policy around scholarships. It was elitist, it was exclusive, put a DEI lens to that, and it weeded people out, not brought them in. So we had to have a policy change. And then my director is still going through the changing of contracts of how can we give. But we now have a much more inclusive approach to accessing resources to help people within the safety field. Those can be secondary, post-secondary, and or professional development grants. We have two types now. One that goes to professionals that could be new, trying to get, and that is essentially money giveaway. Here's $500, you want to go to conference, we'll sponsor you, whatever. People that have barriers to access to knowledge. So we are positioning the foundation to remove barriers that were otherwise in place. That's important because then you're building up the pipeline. The other thing we did with the foundation was we changed governance. We went through a transition to get to one board, and then it was a 3-year transition cycle. As people cycled off, we replaced them with ASSP board members. So as of July 1, I will have one governing body with strategic accountability for the foundation and for ASSP. Why is that important? My strategic plan that I inherited was very operational. I'll go back to the shield. So those were the assets I had on one side. If you looked at the assets I had on the society side, I had 36,000 members around the world, chapters that are independent organizations, not unusual in our world, all doing things different and none of them in alignment. I had 4 very strong silos within the organization that didn't, education for us was a transaction, not a strategy. I'll say that again. It's how I pay the bills, not how I drive things forward. That had to change. How we looked at what we now term knowledge transfer became, over the last 5 years, an integrated approach to what we're doing. For example, we used to always sell standards. Now, when we do an education program, we want to keep people alive. Let's go back to mission. Can't do everything for free. But when we do a deep dive in education, we now give them the resource that then supports them. We charge them. So small steps in organizational integration. It crosses over when I look at this in the development of one cohesive strategy around workforce development. It's not only train, so foundation's public good. So we're doing a lot more out there for free. Society is, and I'll get you my philosophy of to the door and through the door. But we had to change things in basic business. But I had to understand what those systems and structures were first. So the workforce development goals for ASSP in this strategic plan will be an integrated strategy across both assets with a clear line of sight of what is ASSP's responsibility in that journey. That's different than what our member companies are responsible for. So maintain education. So we did what would meeting the learner where they are. So back to that pyramid, knowing where those that you are serving sits, you have to create unique value propositions to bridge from people that are not connected to where they start to connect up to the company. And as a association, you can serve in any one of those buckets. It's again, picking the right bucket. The other thing we paid attention to really closely is the need for sustained, repeatable, structural process to drive relevant content forward. We had to do an asset inventory of 400 plus products and services and do what I know is hard, let go of some, eliminate things. And we looked at it actually on a maturity curve too. Is it outdated? Yeah, it's a good seller, but what's the competition? We did a complete SWOT analysis across 400 plus products and had to cull out so that we could focus energy and efforts on the most valuable. And the other thing we did was say, we're not going to go, hard for our membership, go back and, go back to high school or go back to middle school. I've heard that. And we had to educate our membership and our board that the right point of entry for us is our student chapters. Somebody has already recruited them in, and we lose them into membership. And part of that is they don't really understand organizational structure. And even though we give them, free membership their first year, so keep the people you're already touching and then bleed back. And the other thing that is unique, and well, may not be unique to us, but 60% of our membership comes from another discipline. So it's not as if they are starting out in a nursing career and become nurses. So developing that journey for somebody that could be mid-career, and I'm confident every one of you has had the discussion, let's just transition the veterans into our careers. And there is huge opportunity to do that. In my experience across 14 sectors, that population is not ready to consider a job until 12 to 18 months out of transition. Not only that, everything during their mental build to what's next in their life is sending them to education. The redesign of the GI Bill during our Middle East conflicts dedicated more resources to advancing their education path. So if they were a truck driver somewhere, they don't want to be a truck driver anymore. So they're going to go to school, find their way. So again, back to what are the local education assets that you can tap into that then become build-up strategies. And that's not to say there aren't veterans, but another strategy I often heard was, well, let's go back into their transition programs, their TAP programs, their transition assistance programs. Very few are successful in doing that. So that's the other thing is think about what your position and power is in the larger economy. Safety's in everything, but nobody thinks about safety as a career. I'm not going to get somebody like I might in manufacturing or in healthcare or even in hospitality to create programs specific for me unless I have that power. So within that, back to the continuum, when you've answered all those questions, you start to get to where do I focus my effort, energy, and resources. And it can be in the identification, it can be in the attraction, it can be in the engagement, and it can be in the conversion, building engagement over time. And that's where, again, roles and responsibilities can differ between what you do and what you support your membership in doing. That's, again, another one of those continuums. Here's what it looks like for us. We are positioning, and we have done things that we didn't do before, like accept federal funding to put content free and out into the market. And we are repositioning. So our foundation served almost 1,000 people last year. And the majority of that service happened through the free offerings of knowledge, some of which had continuing education for the certification. We are not the certifying bodies. In fact, our fiercest competitor is the certifying body. But giving free CEUs to professionals to build their career. They may or may not be members. Accepting federal funds to create free content around pandemic planning, pandemic response, and Fall from Heights, #1 issue right behind traffic incidences. So giving free content away to employers to allow them to have safety run better. That also creates a pipeline development strategy and a funnel to, if they like the content, they may come back for more. So we are positioning the foundation as our public face to getting people to the door. The link then becomes, once they're to the door, how do we pull them through the door? By delivering value and knowledge, ungated, then into ASSP, because our anchor of our upcoming strategic plan is going to be community. You know, we have fierce competition within our market for knowledge transfer, education, a lot of stuff I'm confident you guys have experienced. That whole idea that I'm going to make all my money off education, which again, back to the trends, Denise, is something I knew up front. Knowledge is a commodity. It's how you create value around that knowledge that ensures long-term sustainability. So positioning foundation, much bigger service, much bigger reach, means more marketing, more stuff for free, different business model. And actually in the transition of our scholarship policy, I had to come up with money to do that. So we changed the fees in which we were subsidizing giving out scholarships to having an administrative charge. That now funds the staff that gets to do this other stuff. And that didn't happen overnight. Again, my director is still transitioning some of those grants. So that's how I think about it in my current role. And then where within those are you educating, recruiting, or building your own? That's when you get into the next level of detail of what kinds of things can you take advantage of and fit into. You can, if there are technical programs, link into those. That's one of the easiest things to do because, again, the education system struggles, especially community and technical colleges, with placing students. You know, employers say, oh yeah, give me this, but no, I won't guarantee a hire. What we did in the auto industry, and we did the same thing in manufacturing. So 20 years later, replicated in manufacturing, led by Toyota, this case, the FAME model. Any student, we got employers during my tenure at the Manufacturing Institute to agree that any student with an industry certification that had come out of a program of study that we had recognized as quality was guaranteed an interview, not guaranteed a job, guaranteed an interview. We removed a huge barrier to most candidates because, you know, Google Analytics or whatever they're using's job is to screen people out because there isn't enough capacity within HR. So we created what I would call a market signal to employers. So Shira, in your world, job postings then began to say, industry credential recognized. I'm going to guarantee, but I'm going to acknowledge that you've done something that we say is good and valuable from an industry perspective. Stop judging degrees, start judging industry competencies. So to those of you that have industry certifications, that's one of those levers of change that's really easy to drive because the second it shows up in a job posting, everybody understands what that means. So in the recruiting side, there are job boards you can do. There is on-the-job training, there's pre-employment training, and there's internships. Every one of those can be a service to your membership if that's where the market need is. Further you go down that, if, you know, pre-employment training, and that's something we're thinking of, is we haven't decided whether we're going to do it or not. We are more likely to start with once they're hired. Let's give them the finishing in safety that they actually need. And then there is the build your own. And again, the build your own can be you or you supporting your members in building their own.
Jennifer, before you go on, so Denise asked, what is your measure of quality?
It's a good question, Denise. So I'll give you two examples. I'll give you the automotive industry and the problem they were solving. I'll go back to the root cause of the issue was dealerships. dealerships have an industry validation, ASE, Automotive Service Excellence. You will not likely ever take your car to a dealership that doesn't have a proudly ASE certified. It is the gold standard for a place of business, the equivalent of the Chamber of Commerce recognition. Their academic validation is NATEF certification. So our effort went into, and interestingly enough, much like for any of you that have to deal with ABET accredited programs, it took years to achieve industry certification. So during my time at U.S. Department of Labor, having come from the automotive industry into labor, one of the things we did was redefine the NATEF process to remove barriers for instructors to achieve NATEF certification. So back to the where is the bottleneck in the process flow. So that was a very defined. I'll flip that to manufacturing. So under my time at U.S. Department of Labor, and some of this is going to be in the resource stuff I send to you. Under my time at U.S. Department of Labor, again, having come out of manufacturing, we spent a lot of time in manufacturing at labor because, you know, good quality jobs, high paying, most of them. There were 450 plus certificates and certifications in industry, none of which we at the Manufacturing Institute, the 501c3 to the National Association of Manufacturers, controlled. And we said, if we can, we did this as soon as I got there after I left labor, because it wasn't government's job to say what good was. We created, when I was at labor, something called a competency framework. And we pulled together those organizations and said, if you looked at it again, back from a pyramid and a skills development, and what industry had told me, show up on time, willing to learn, drug-free, then show up on day 2. Everybody back to that 80% of everybody needed the same. We mapped the credentials. So if you have a very devolved system of certification, we mapped the credentials and ended up with 4 entry-level credentials that essentially covered the majority of manufacturing jobs. And if everybody had those coming through a program of study. The other thing I did when I was at labor was we changed federal regulation around job training. That to the $15 billion publicly funded workforce investment system, industry training had to align to an industry demand. And that was measured by an industry certification. So within that public system, if the federal government is going to invest in training, they are required, where possible, to ensure that person achieves an industry certification. So those are what define quality. At the Manufacturing Institute, we did a call out to community and technical colleges and says, hey, we'll promote you out to our members. If you achieve certifications, just tell us which one. So they became endorsed by the Manufacturing Institute. That subsequently got codified in a very structured program called the FAME program that still runs at the Institute today. That's important because whether you control it or empower it is another one of those resource allocations. In my tenure, we empowered. In the individual after, the FAME program moved into the Institute and they control it. So they control, that would be under both the education and the recruiting. Companies pay to be a part of the FAME program to have the opportunity to have access to students trained exactly the way they want them. So did that answer that question of quality? Okay. So the last thing is resources. I can imagine if you were not me, you were fed with a fire hose over the last 45 minutes. And it's a lot, but there are a ton of resources out there that can help you. And I'll start with the competency models and the hot seat I sat in with the Secretary of Education. I got called down to her office. Jennifer, why are you doing this? And we created competency models. We said, what skills do people need? We did it across every sector, and those exist today. That information is up and available, and there is a whole set of tools. Again, this has started in the Clinton administration, gone through Clinton, Bush, Obama. Obama actually, their administration called me and says, Jennifer, let's just be clear. We're not resourcing your job. It's something else, but can you give me everything you did? So there's a lot of value in tools out there that can help you with that. There are also, and I put up the FAME model, which is the sort of high touch, high investment built over 10 years. The thing that is unique about the FAME model, and this is another consideration, if you're being driven by those that hold you accountable to the pipeline strategy, you can't build that alone. There are youth serving groups that require, biggest one is Skills USA. In the healthcare, it's HOSA. Being engaged, and First Robotics is another that gets a lot of play out in the market space. They are STEM related or career specific. HOSA is, again, all healthcare. Having members engaged in that exposes them, because there's student competitions and internships and a whole set of stuff. Partner with people that are already pulling together that pipeline, whether it's a community technical college. So when you get down to brass tacks should include what are the education assets or service providers that are helping organizations with this problem. So don't feel you have to create the wheel on your own. The question is, how do you plug into that system? Because in the end, everyone wants the same thing. And that was my experience at labor. People want jobs. And the last I will say comes back to the trends and the culture and the reality. Not every job has the same value. If you are in an industry representing individuals that are not paying a livable wage, that are okay with 100% turnover, you will run up a hill forever, because people will follow the 4 nickel more. There is a requirement of companies to continue to evolve their talent strategies. And what I know about business is they're incredibly resilient, and they're going to solve to the problem. And the solution could be automation, or it could be moving the job somewhere else. So soul search yourself to say, what does this mean? What does the culture of those I'm serving mean to the long-term strategy? So you don't end up spending a bunch of money where the solution really was a technology transfer or a job relocation. The last thing is, there are, in fact, experts and examples in the marketplace. The Jobs for the Future is probably one of the biggest inside the Beltway players that has a lot of clout in helping companies, sectors, etc. It's led by a woman by the name of Maria Flynn. She was actually at labor when I was there. Phenomenal organization. A lot of my team members have worked with them from labor, have worked with them. The other one is the Council on Adult and Experiential Learning. So they are 2 models. But I've seen models in almost every sector. And if you go into the U.S. Department of Labor resource number 1, Competency Model Clearinghouse, look at a couple of the sectors, in addition to tools and resources that they have for you. It also shows the associations that are engaged, National Retail Federation, home builders, big players that are driving change. And there is, I think, opportunity. I just had this conversation with one of the associations that did the early work with me in manufacturing. Safety is a manufacturing issue. So I don't feel like I need to do this all alone. I'm going to go to the biggest sectors that represent my membership: construction, manufacturing, oil and gas, and say, how do I help with this component? The other is the National Staffing Association. I've had conversations with their legal counsel, because incidences in my world, so that's the last slide, incidences in my world happen with the fluidity of the workforce. So chances are the incident is going to happen in the first 90 to 120 days, which is, for many of those that I serve, their staffing strategy at the front end of the pipeline is, I'm going to manage that risk by transferring it to somebody else. Doesn't mean people still don't get hurt. So again, back to that philosophy, how could I then work with the staffing association to make sure the best content and exposure goes back into their customer base, because they are the individuals of record for that. So a lot to think about. Shira, what else? I would say, I see, is there something else in the chat?
Yeah, well, I'm going to actually
that I
pick up
can respond to.
a follow-on question myself, actually. The last slide that you had up, you mentioned a couple of practical resources, the JFF and the CAEL. Could you share with us a little bit more about how associations can leverage those two organizations specifically to help them with their workforce planning?
Sure, absolutely. And I will say I haven't looked at what their priorities are right now, but they are masterful at getting federal funds to support, I don't want to call them at-risk, but individuals that have the opportunity for economic advancement. Both of them serve what is the majority of entry-level individuals, and those aren't just by age, those could be by skill level too. And they are leaders in helping build a career trajectory for those individuals. What every workforce development professional suffers from, and the only time I did not suffer from it was when I had the OEM sitting around the table in the auto industry, because it was a mandate back to them, is they suffer from the willingness of employers to engage. That's where and how. So I, at the Manufacturing Institute, for example, had conversations about how my membership could support apprenticeship. Kale, I did a lot of work with when I was at Labor, and they created apprenticeship programs in the healthcare industry for the CNA types, for the phlebotomists, for the building from here up. The other tool that we used heavily at the Manufacturing Institute is ACT's assessment. That is more a, if you look, they are known for assessments in the academic space, but they also have a workforce development assessment. It's called WorkKeys. And the difference between ACT and ETS, which is the high stakes testing, is ETS weeds people out, ACT measures potential. So their workforce development WorkKeys is used pretty heavily, and there is an opportunity to map skills to a WorkKeys assessment that has different levels. So if you don't have an industry credential, or you're trying to get the step below to those people that won't qualify, something like a WorkKeys could be a guide to you, and then that could open up access to the public systems that are supporting people trying to transition into jobs.
Great. Rich, Jennifer. So rich. I think the whole sector needs this, right? This is a hopefully you will consider presenting this to ASE at some point. This is really, this is worthy of sectoral viewing. So questions from folks, specific questions for Jennifer, or maybe you'd like to share your own professional or industry workforce challenges. Maybe we can do a little deep dive. We've got a little time. Anybody want to share their case study? TJ?
Oh, hi. No, well, challenges for it's interesting because we're going to undertake an effort to review our mission and vision statements. And so we work in airport development, and our strategic plan that we developed in 2018 has actually been remarkably resilient in the three kind of themes of future of airports and air travel, second in advocacy, and third in the workforce. And as a staff of 6 in this update, I'm going to call the question on what the heck do we need to focus on, because we can't do all three. And when we send out this survey, I know we're going to hear we need more people. And I'm sure every single person on this screen would hear the same thing from their constituents. So anyway, I thought this was incredibly informative as it relates to just, first of all, Jennifer, the amount of knowledge and what you're doing in general, and just the scope of what it takes to actually be able to make a move the rope on this in some form is pretty remarkable. And I think at a minimum, it's been immensely helpful to be able to tell the board to kind of right set expectations on what exactly this entails. So I appreciate it.
Other thoughts? Case study? Jennifer, anything you want to
Well,
comment?
I would offer, TJ, that if you ever find yourself in the position of struggling with helping them to communicate, I'm happy to tell them that I ran a portfolio of $1 billion and that didn't solve the problem. So if this knowledge in a very streamlined executive way could be helpful to make sure that you pick the right, and I'm not saying do nothing. As you can tell within ASSP, I've been driving towards, and by the time we get to the end of this strategic plan, that we'll have a workforce development will have changed, policies will have changed, expectations will have changed. That's a 10-year journey. So the other is the time horizon of expectations. So if I can ever offer help or guidance in positioning that, I'm happy to do that.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
And one last thing, and someone commented on this, we just started a foundation with grants to attend kind of our biggest technical conference. And your remarks on selecting people that don't necessarily need the help, best GPAs and everything was really helpful. So thank you for that.
Great. So Wanda and then Michael. And then Kathy.
So hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation, which was great. For me, the struggle is that I'm dealing with medical professionals, and the group that controls the requirements for dietitians, which is the largest of my constituency, has come out with a new requirement that they're going to need to have master level education in order to sit for the exam. So I'm struggling because I don't control that. I don't necessarily understand it, although I'm trying to get some clarification, because I now see that as creating a barrier, and perhaps an unintended consequence will be the fact that people won't pursue it. And from the underrepresented minority perspective, you've now added yet another, loop that costs money, to have to get a master's degree. And one of the ironies is the master's degree can be in anything. So I don't know that I don't fully understand. I know that I believe the goal is to try to lift the profession by trying to have this additional requirement, but I'm really concerned about the unintended consequences. And now trying to position my organization to look at how we can help with that, in terms of information training, et cetera. So I just wanted to say thank you, because there were several points along the way that you made a comment about being realistic, understanding, what the inherent challenges are to what it is you're trying to accomplish, and being cognizant of that as you create a plan, because we're also focused on workforce and helping the board. The board finally, I think, understands what I see, which is the workforce is aging and retiring, and younger people are not coming into this field. So we've got we've got a challenge we've got to address. So I just wanted to say thank you. It really is helpful in helping me think about different ways, even though you're in a very different industry, ways that systems can be engaged to try to help move this needle. So thank you.
Thank you, Wanda. Michael and then Kathy.
Yeah, this is interestingly enough, kind of follow-up to what Wanda just said. You, Jennifer, in your presentation, you said something like, I'm not sure I got the entire thing, was like, stop judging degrees and start judging, I don't remember the rest.
Competencies?
Competencies, right, that's what it was. And I'd like you to expand on that, because like what we just heard, there seems to be this thing about, get another degree, and not even necessarily in the field for which the work is. So I'm wondering, what you think needs to be done so that the competencies become what we judge more than just, the pigskin.
I would say this cultural so there is degree escalation. When I was at labor and McDonald's was saying you had to have a 4-year degree to get a job there. I mean, it is a cultural understanding. So Wanda, to your point, and Michael, to yours, you need to know the culture, but you also have to bring forward what that culture creates, be it diversity, equity, inclusion, be it access, or be it limit. So if in fact the dietitians control the credential, they shouldn't require the master's degree because the credential should represent the competencies. It is a false narrative from a work expectation. And what I know about employers is they are going to hire people and train them their way, period. Because they're going to look for fit, they're going to look for culture. It's a false sense. It's like my membership saying, oh, online education doesn't work, yet people hire huge numbers of people that come through safety degrees that are online. Market has to drive the demand, and the best conversation back is to engage the market with data and research that says you're creating a block. Stop it. So, and I will tell you, there are huge structural changes that are happening. You are more and more, and I used to ask this of manufacturers all the time, don't raise your hand, but ask yourself the question, how many of you are driving your kids to a 4-year degree? It may or it is not. I'm a great example of how many years it took me to get through, because I went through every major in the book and, decided maybe I really didn't want this, because what I was always really good at was the world of work. It wasn't respected for me to go that path and then go back and get it. Education and knowledge should, and I think the sheer structural cost of higher education is driving this change. They are having and being forced to adapt because parents are questioning. There's more dual enrollment. There's a lot more flexibility, but we are a long way, society, good or bad, including in the workplace, is judging against false markers that may or may not be what's required. But that's a societal culture change that I hate to say it goes back to World War II and the GI Bill. I mean, culturally it shifted after World War II when every veteran came home to opportunity for a college degree, reinforced by every other conflict and how parents then judged, I want more from. And if you look at it longitudinally, there is arguments to be made that higher education has an influence, but it should be evaluated at when and what the job output is.
What's interesting is that in the recruiting world, thankfully, there's a counterbalance now, right? From a DEI lens, because there are more and more states in the union. Maryland happens to be one of them, at least for Maryland government jobs. But there are more states now that are actually requiring employers not to look at that 4-year degrees when hiring. Like, it's illegal, right? In some places, you can, if for certain jobs, right? Not for everything, not for lawyers, right? But for a lot of professional positions now, to open up access, right? To say, look, not everybody can afford to get a degree. Why are you requiring this? And that's going to be a barrier. They're just opening it up, which is wonderful. And I imagine that this, just like with the pay transparency thing, that's been catching on like wildfire. I hope, I pray, right, that the degree will also, the lack of the degree requirement will go away too. So
one other Shira on that, even in my own building, the previous CEO had everybody needs a master's degree mentality. You didn't get to, and I don't have a master's degree. I have about 4 undergraduate degrees. I'm very flexible, but I forced my team to go through an internal competency evaluation to drive really what was needed in the job. And that to me is part of the leadership that we as executives drive culturally in our building and within our membership.
absolutely. All right, Kathy, and then TJ.
Thanks. I was going to comment on something else, but then as you were talking about, the 4-year degree, Discover E, we're Discover Engineering. So we're a nonprofit that we are trying to build interest and engagement and excitement K through 12, higher ed, build the pipeline for engineers. And I'll comment quickly on the four-year degree. We just did a whole research study on messages matter, and the message that resonated the most, we did it with students and parents, was that engineering is for everyone. But it was also the least believable. And it was, a lot of it was, and throughout our survey, we were also testing, could we move the needle in our survey with perceptions? And that perception that you need a four-year degree or higher to be an engineer was a barrier. And we said, hey, guess what? You can be in the engineering community, technologist, technician. You can go out of high school, you can do a 2-year associate degree, and they are very high paying jobs. And that even in our survey work, perceptions changed, and parents were like, oh, this is a great idea. And students too, especially the ones that we found were able to change their perception the most were the ones in the DE&I. So messages matter, which is the name of our research. It's really key in a lot of what we're talking about. But I wanted to highlight, Jennifer, something you said, because we are supported, like we're trying to get people excited about STEM jobs early, because we find that really works. So I was just going to point out, because you talked about that when you're working with your memberships in these different STEM type of career associations, find the nonprofit partners who are in this space and figure out how you can support them, because we know that if we have a STEM professional working with a teacher in the classroom, that is a game changer. And as early as, fourth grade, we even do kindergarten and pre, but it's kind of making students aware of what's out there and getting them excited. And it's meeting that STEM professional is like key. So don't create your new programs. There's tons of nonprofits out there doing amazing work. And to Jennifer's point, that's that's what we do really well. That's what we excel at. And then you can focus on what you excel at. So I'm just going to throw that out there, because I think there's so many out there that can team up with different societies and associations and build pipeline.
Skills USA, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, is a huge one. TJ?
And not to be redundant, but exactly what Kathy said. I just talked to, so we deal a lot with professional engineers, architects, this big certification, big capital P, capital E behind there. I just talked to a CEO that's been out of the industry and came back and is now running a large engineering company, really kind of who I consider one of the thought leaders. And he said on the workforce issue, they are hiring non-engineers and bringing them in there, and they have a PE in there to be able to sign off and make sure the work is done. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us. I'm looking at Kathy and others in the engine, and maybe other items that you don't necessarily need that capital P and the capital E in there to try to get people in and get them developed where they need to be.
PJ, interestingly enough, so our roots was ASSE, American Society of Safety Engineers. 20% of our membership was actually engineers. The rest was the P. And one of the governance changes we made, because again, back to a barrier of advancement in your career, is we removed the requirement to be we do have, bifurcated membership. Professional has requirements of credentialing and or years in service. We removed, with exception of the board of directors, the requirement that somebody be a professional member to serve as a volunteer leader. So again, I'd still like to get to the board. That's still a barrier of inclusion, but they're not quite ready. But I became the E2P CEO. The name change happened before me in July, and I joined in August. And they do culturally, the engineers sometimes point at me of, oh, you're the one, you're the reason. But that's the reality of our membership too. So both of you are spot on.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in? Brian, Scott, Ariel?
Yeah, no, this has been a wonderful conversation and hearing. Build is an entrepreneurship education in the high school space. I work in business development and bring the programming to new districts around the United States, and we work a lot with CTE programs. So it's a proven model, Jennifer. So really, thank you. It's just connecting the dots, right? Entrepreneurship crosses all the threads. We focus on 6 21st century skills: communication, collaboration, grit, self-management, problem solving, and innovation, sorely needed in all of our associations and industries. So, we hired 2 people to help develop the pathways. We used to be all about 4-year university as our theory of change, and now we've really broadened and are more inclusive to understand all the pathways, to include direct placement, going into the military, looking at being a first responder, the trades, certainly community college, and definitely an uptick on dual enrollment. Community colleges are thriving, working with high schools right now because there's such a gap. And if anything, 4 years are down and community colleges might be a little bit up. I haven't looked at the statistical information, but cost effectiveness is certainly there for that. So I couldn't agree with this more, that the gap needs to be closed with industry and corporate reaching down to the high schools and changing it to be a CTE model, because school is boring and these kids hate going. The enrollment rate is down. The engagement rate is down as far as going to school. School sucks. I don't know how it was for you in high school, but being lectured at isn't fun. So project-based learning is the way to go. Hands-on, use your mind, use your hands, and make it happen. So I just thank you for bringing this up and lifting it. And for us, developing the pathways into any industry is of interest. So if you want to reach out, feel free to.
Jennifer, speaking of the CTE, how practical is it for any one of these associations to leverage a CTE? Now, I know their members, of course, are the CTE, so I don't know, maybe that's just that's a level up, but is there value, do you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would say to Kathy's earlier point, go to those that are having the biggest influence, or those that are having the influence in your footprint. Those are, jobs are local, education's local. You have to get down to the local. So go where you have, if I were overlaying a heat map, go where the heat map is, see what the programs are, figure out the alignment and the bridge between what they're doing and where you need them to be. Back to just show up on time, ready to learn, I'll take it from there. So again, there's this disconnect in expectation. So I don't mean to belittle that, but.
Got it. Scott?
So I thought it was an interesting conversation, especially about the educational components. That's something that we tackled last year when we were doing a hiring, and we made sure that our job description did not require that college degree, because the position that we were hiring for, it wasn't necessary. And obviously that's it's not something that you ignore, but it was something that wasn't a requirement, so we didn't build it in. And in our industry, and I think back to my former association as well as my current one, we're a very niche organization. And so the number of members, the scale of hiring that's taking place is a lot smaller than like all safety professionals or the entire auto industry or something like that. So it's been harder for us to really design something that can reach people in a way that that moves the needle for our members. And we've kind of steered to the direction of giving them tools and letting them build their own, and rather than us being the driving force of the workforce development, but allowing the companies that are able to do it to engage in that. And certainly your comments about that extra nickel is something that really resonated. There's a lot of folks in our industry that really nickel and dime people, and then all they do is they steal employees from each other, and nobody's really developing new. So it's frustrating.
Scott, specific on that, one of the things I did when I was at the Institute was we mapped out the cost of 4 nickel more. What was the turnover associated with the cost of a hire? And it was 1.5 times comp. So if you can reduce and do the math equation to don't turn over, pay a little bit more, you can make a business case of why wages need to go up.
Yeah.
And one of the fields, one of the jobs that we are really seeking the most help for is requires a commercial driver's license. And so that's a credential that is a challenge and a barrier. And in our case, they need a passenger endorsement to be able to drive the motor coaches over and above what you need for a freight truck. And so getting people that can meet that requirement. And in this day and age, one of the biggest obstacles is that clean drug test. There's so many people that are finding substances that are now legal in their state, in their community, and they don't want to have to forswear that in order to get that CDL.
By the way, Scott, I'll mention this to you just as an offline, but maybe this is appropriate for others. So one of our case members, Steve Kaminsky from the National Propane Gas Association. So his members are in the propane world, right? But of course, the truckers, the drivers rather, that have to ship, transfer the propane, they need the CDL. Well, his association is now creating an online CDL training that he wants to open up to other industries, specifically to address the challenge of having people who can't physically go to, right, a brick and mortar location, but might be able to get online. So you two of you might want to connect to see if maybe you can offer that to your members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they need a special hazmat endorsement too for hauling that. So it's like, the extra criteria to fit into a niche area is critical. And then obviously some of that has to be behind the wheel, but you can do a lot of that training in a remote classroom environment.
This has been really rich and robust. Anyone else want to chime in? And again, as you see, the call is recorded. I'll send it to the whole group. Feel free to share far and wide, right? Share with your members, right? This is very, very rich information. So thank you, Jennifer. Round of applause. Appreciate your time, sharing your expertise. This is a real give back, for you. Thank you so much. All right, I'll end. Yes, definitely heart emoji. So if anyone has, and I'll say this for the benefit of this group and anyone watching, if anyone else on this in our group has deep dive expertise that you believe would be beneficial to this larger association executive committee, please let me know. Happy to keep doing these deep dives, and could be consultants as well, right? We all have people have different levels of expertise and things. So whether that's for the industry, right, side of things, helping your members, or of course just right helping be a better association executive. Certainly open to all topics. All right, everyone. Thanks very much again for your time.
Thank you, Shira, for bringing us together. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it. Thank you,
My
Jennifer.
pleasure. All right, have a blessed day.
Have a great day.
Take care.